Presidential historian Tevi Troy has called his latest book The Power and the Money. He focuses on the epic clashes between commanders-in-chief and the titans of industry. Mr. Troy has spent most of his professional life in and around Washington-based government and politics. He is currently a senior fellow at the Bipartisan Policy Center. In the introduction, he writes, quote, "For current and future CEOs, this book can be a guide for how to engage with an increasingly powerful and involved federal government, especially in our era in which both Democrats and Republicans target corporations in their rhetoric and often in their policy prescriptions."
Hi, I'm Susan Swain. Campaign 2024 has evolved in some unexpected ways, and from now until Election Day, C-SPAN promises you unfiltered coverage of the candidates as they battle to win the White House and Congress. You may not know that C-SPAN is a private company that operates without a dime of government money. And like many media organizations, we've been impacted by cord cutting. This summer, we are asking for you to help support our unbiased political coverage with a donation. Here's the good news. 100% of your contribution, large or small, directly supports C-SPAN operations. And best of all, an anonymous donor has pledged to match your donation dollar for dollar up to $25,000. You can find out more at cspan.org/donate. Help ensure that C-SPAN's unique, long-form coverage of politics is here to stay. Visit cspan.org/donate. Thank you for watching, and thanks so much for your support.
Tevi Troy, what's the book about?
The book, The Power and the Money, is about CEOs and presidents, big-name CEOs, Ford, Rockefeller, Musk, Gates, and their reaction and their interactions with multiple presidents. Unlike a president who has a limited term, a CEO can last multiple presidencies, and in doing so, they can interact with multiple presidents, and you can see how they've dealt with different presidents. Sometimes they like them, sometimes they don't, and that gives you a sense of what strategies work for dealing with Washington.
Why'd you do the book?
Well, as you know, Brian, I've written a lot of books about presidents and blank. And each time the blank is something that nobody has ever covered before, but also something that's in the news of the moment. And there is this big of the moment right now in terms of how both Democrats and Republicans seem to dislike corporations. Why are corporations in the crosshairs of both parties? And I think the story of presidents' interactions with CEOs, sometimes enmities, sometimes friendships, but those interactions over the course of a century and a half have led us to the current moment where corporations are kind of in bad odor in Washington.
Why is that?
Well, I think what we've seen is an enmeshment of big government and big business. And as I lay out in the book, government has gotten ever bigger over the time since John D. Rockefeller started his oil empire with nary a government regulator or regulation in sight. And now everything a company does has to go through government. The types of people you hire, the products you can sell, what countries you can sell them to. I'm not saying that government limits these companies' abilities to make profits, because they make a lot of profits. But the enmeshment and the rise of this tangle of regulations means that corporations have to have government in mind in everything they do. And it means that government is shaping what corporations do and how they approach public policy. So in some ways, corporations are an actor on behalf of government, and the smart CEOs realize that and take advantage of it.
Which person that you talk about, and you talk about a bunch, I think it was 18?
18 different CEOs.
18 different CEOs. Which one did you enjoy researching the most?
I loved Lew Wasserman. He was a Hollywood mogul. He started as nobody in Cleveland, became an agent, became the head of his agency. Then he wanted to buy a studio, and that was against the rules at the time, and it caught the ire of Bobby Kennedy, who was the Attorney General of the United States at the time. And Wasserman, who had studiously ignored government his whole career, suddenly said, I have to pay attention to government. And he got really good at it. He befriended LBJ, became very close and a tight advisor to him. He refriended Ronald Reagan, with whom he had had a falling out, and Reagan actually overturned a potential regulation that would have been a free market regulation because of Wasserman's lobbying. And then he was also very close to Bill Clinton, whom he identified as a governor of Arkansas and recognized that this Clinton guy had potential. So Wasserman was really a master of the Washington game.
How much of his success was due to how much money he gave to these candidates?
Well, it's a good question. He sort of started the pipeline of Democratic money coming from Hollywood. And before that, it really wasn't necessarily seen as a Democratic fundraising pipeline. But Ronald Reagan wasn't getting a lot of money from Wasserman. Wasserman was known as someone who gave sage advice, and people liked to listen to him. And he also listened back, and he was a good person to communicate with. He would stay up late at night with Lyndon Johnson in the White House. And one time he saw Mrs. Johnson and kind of apologized for keeping Johnson up late. And Mrs. Johnson said, "No, you don't understand. He loves this. This is really what he lives for, this kind of interaction."
What was he like?
Wasserman?
Yeah.
He was tall. He was severe. He had these very serious glasses, big glasses at a time when people didn't wear them. He had these rules for his agents. One of them was not talking to the press. He said, "Stay out of the spotlight. It fades your suit." He also had a great motto, which I think you'll like. It was, think Yiddish, dress British. He had very, very good clothes, but he kind of had a Jewish head for business, he would say.
What would the average person know that he did?
The average person at the time, in the 50s and 60s, I think would know him as a Hollywood mogul, big player in Hollywood. I think today he's not as well known.
But what big things did he do that we would know in his consumer world?
He got the first $1 million contracts for some actors, including Ronald Reagan. And then when he was head of Universal, it had some very big movies, including Jaws, which was Steven Spielberg's first big hit. So he was kind of instrumental in the development of Hollywood.
The story that got my attention, and I want you to talk about it, was Henry Ford.
Yeah, Henry Ford, also a fascinating character. He was a tinkerer, and he wanted to make a horseless carriage. I guess that's what they called it before. They called it automobiles. And he was playing around with all different designs. And if there was a race, other people were trying to do it too. At one point, he meets Thomas Edison and shows him his sketches. And Edison says, you've got to keep at it. He encourages him, and they eventually became very close friends. He eventually develops the Model T Ford, which becomes the best-selling car in America and makes him a multimillionaire. And he became kind of iconic figure in America. There were Henry Ford jokes. There were even Henry Ford joke books. And when Ford wants to get a little involved in politics, he's particularly opposed to World War I and wants to make sure the U.S. does not get involved. He goes to the White House to lobby Woodrow Wilson to make sure the U.S. doesn't get involved. He obviously failed because the U.S. did get involved a few years later. But he breaks the ice with Wilson by telling a Henry Ford joke.
What's a Henry? What, you remember the joke?
I do remember the joke.
What was it?
It was about a man who is building a very large grave. And someone comes up and asks, "Why are you building such a large grave?" He said, "I want to be buried with my Ford." And he said, "Why do you want to be buried with your Ford?" He said, "Well, my Ford has gotten me out of every hole up to now, and I'm confident it'll get me out of this one as well." And Wilson laughed at it as well.
You point out that he owned a newspaper.
Yes, the Dearborn Independent.
That it was anti-Semitic.
It was, virulently so sometimes. And Ford was anti-Semitic, but in a weird way, in that he allowed this paper to print terrible anti-Semitic stuff, and he had some anti-Semitic theories. But he was also personal friends with a number of Jews. One of the designers of his factories was Jewish, so he wasn't unable to interact with Jewish people, but he did have these kind of crackpot anti-Semitic theories. And unfortunately for him, Adolf Hitler noticed them. He's the one American mentioned in Mein Kampf. Ford eventually recognizes that perhaps that anti-Semitism is wrong, but more definitively that it's a problem for his business, and he backs away from the anti-Semitism. But no matter, he wasn't able to overcome this reputation, and still 100 years later we're talking about his anti-Semitism.
What did he do for Hitler?
He didn't really do anything for Hitler. Hitler just liked his theories about the workplace and how to build better factories. So Hitler cited him and probably liked that he was anti-Semitic as well.
But you talk about the fact that they changed his name of the company in Germany, so it reflected a German name besides the Ford name.
Yes, there was a German offshoot of Ford that built munitions for the Nazis. And Henry Ford didn't really have control over that company because Germany was a dictatorship, and they did change the name. And so there was this company called Ford that was building stuff for the Nazis that was no longer in Ford's control, but it certainly didn't look good for Ford.
When was the first time he became aware and friendly to a government, and who, besides Woodrow Wilson, who was it? How did he do it?
Well, after Wilson, where he has that kind of weird interaction, and also Wilson encourages him to run for Senate in 1918, which is not successful. He runs in Michigan. He then gets involved with these guys called the Vagabonds. And it's not anything nefarious. It's just these four guys, including Edison, and also a writer named Burroughs, also the head of Firestone Company, Harvey Firestone. And they would go away for these summer trips. They would go in a Ford, and they would take pictures of them. And they kind of became a famous American arcana, I guess. They would go to these different places, and people would look to them and say, oh, look, these fancy rich people are doing these vacations across America. And sometimes they would invite presidents. So Warren G. Harding went to visit the Vagabonds. Calvin Coolidge, his replacement, went to visit the Vagabonds. And it was a great photo op for presidents. And I think this is an important development that I talk about in the book, that presidents see that interacting with CEOs can be beneficial to them. It can give them a good photo op. It can help them with their own press and their own PR and electoral efforts.
Who hated the government the most that you talked about?
Henry Ford was definitely up there. He did not like government. He did not like the New Deal. He thought it was semi-fascistic and getting in his face too much. And he made it clear that he was opposed to the New Deal. I think Rockefeller probably would have hated the government if he'd noticed that it was taking him into his sights. He was retired by the time Teddy Roosevelt came after him, but he was still pretty mad about what Roosevelt was doing. But I don't think Rockefeller had any conception of how big and powerful government could become, and I think that was a vulnerability and a weakness of his. So I would say Ford was probably the most anti-government person I look at.
John D. Rockefeller, Standard Oil Company. Which president was responsible for leading the breakup of that company?
Yeah, that would be Teddy Roosevelt, although it happened in 1911 after Roosevelt was no longer president because the Supreme Court, the case went to the Supreme Court, so it happened under Taft. But Teddy Roosevelt was the big trust buster, and he had Standard Oil and Rockefeller in his sights. This was especially after a woman named Ida Tarbell wrote a series of pieces in McClure's magazine that were a sensation about Rockefeller and how Rockefeller, with nefarious, sharp-elbowed tactics, kind of developed this monopoly. As I said earlier, there were no government regulations or regulators that could have stopped Rockefeller. And as Tarbell even acknowledged, what Rockefeller did was not illegal at the time, but it was certainly destructive of many people's businesses, including Tarbell's own father. And so the pieces were a sensation. Teddy Roosevelt read them, and he saw a political opportunity. He went hard after Standard Oil, and he also went hard after Rockefeller, who was now retired, and Roosevelt knew it, but he also knew that the name Rockefeller was a poisonous name, and he took advantage of that.
How much did Rockefeller use his money with politicians?
Rockefeller gave a lot of money to politicians, almost exclusively to Republican politicians, but they weren't involved in politics in the way that a corporation would be today. They thought corporations were, they thought politics was something that was kind of separate and aside from them. They would give money to politicians. Sometimes it didn't work out. They gave money to Teddy Roosevelt, and it didn't benefit them that much. But they weren't kind of on the ground trying to shape things in Washington like you'll see today.
Back in those years, in the early 1900s and all up through Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson and on, how much regulation was there in politics for the giving of money?
There was very little. You did not have the financial limitations. In fact, there's one campaign that I talk about in which J.P. Morgan gives as much money to the Republicans by himself as the Democrats raised for their entire campaign. So you could have one individual or one corporation giving a lot of money back then.
You have a statistic in your book. I want you to, I don't know if you can elaborate on it, but you show that in 2022 that the aggregate sales of the top 500 companies were $41 trillion.
Yeah, the top 500 companies are very rich. They're very powerful. They produce a lot of products that you and I like and use. I mean, the iPhone that's probably in your pocket, comes from one of these big companies. The lights in this room. I mean, they produce things that make our lives easier. So I'm not critical of them in that sense. But if you add up their total power, based on that wealth, they have a lot of it and they exercise it.
When did you first start to learn about all this?
So as I said, I have this theory of presidents and blank. And so after my last book, Fight House, I started thinking about what my next blank would be. And I kept reading all this stuff about how critical both parties were of corporations. And so I started to develop a book proposal on this. But you don't just write a book proposal and come out with a book. And this is probably a 4 or 5 year effort where I had to think through it. I had a couple of salons with the Mercatus Center, where I am a visiting fellow, to think through it with really smart people who know about these issues. And then I had to do a lot of research, and that took a couple of years. And it really wasn't until 2022, 2023 when I started writing, and now we're in 24 and the book's out.
Go back, though, to your own career. When was the first job that you had on Capitol Hill?
So my first job on Capitol Hill was for Chris Cox, who later became the head of the SEC, somebody I not only talked to about the book, but has blurbed the book. Very smart guy about the intersection of business and politics, had an MBA. I then also worked for John Ashcroft from Missouri, a senator. But then I worked for Elaine Chao, who was the Secretary of Labor. She later became Secretary of Transportation in the Trump administration. And she used to tell me really interesting things about corporations. She'd say, we think that corporations are on our side as Republicans, but you don't necessarily want to be in a foxhole with them because they're kind of inconstant allies. They go where the power is. If there's a Democratic administration, they're going to be friendly with the Democratic administration. If there's a Republican administration, they're going to be friendly with the Republican administration. But it's not like you, as a Bush appointee, can count on them as ideological soulmates.
So what year did you work, or years did you work for Chris Cox, Congressman?
I worked for Chris Cox from 1996 to 1998.
What'd you learn from him, besides what you just told us?
Man, did I learn about writing and editing. I thought I knew something about writing, and I would submit papers to him, and they would come back all marked up in red with paragraphs moved, sentences moved, and whole new sections written in by him. And later, when I worked at the White House and I had the opportunity to edit the memos of people on my team, I would do the same thing. And they would say, where did you learn to do that? And I said, Chris Cox.
What did you learn when you were working for Congressman Cox about money that's given to him and what influence it had on his decisions?
He was very careful about that. There were certain lobbyists who were quite free with their with money and gifts and trips at the time, and he wanted us to steer clear of that. He was very above board. He had a counsel who would make sure they looked at the financial contributions, because he knew that was the fastest way to get into trouble, especially as a Republican. If it looks like you're getting a lot of corporate money and it's shaping how you are acting, that is a great way to get criticized, to get blasted in the Washington Post. So he was super careful about that stuff.
Anything new you learned from Senator John Ashcroft?
Yeah, in fact, I remember walking right around here near Capitol Hill, and I said something about lobbyists, and he said, never denigrate lobbyists. They have an important role to play in the process. They usually know more about the subject than anybody else. It doesn't mean you have to take everything they say at face value, but they provide important information for senators and congressmen with which they can make decisions. So I really thought he was thoughtful about the question of lobbyists.
What about the money question with him? Did you notice the influence of money?
I did work for him when he was in cycle. He ran in 2000 and lost to Mel Carnahan, who had died. It was a very famous race where he, the live senator, lost to the corpse governor. But also, what I've noticed about the politicians I've worked for is they are careful on the money front, because they know that it can cause a bad headline, and whatever amount of money you get from corporations isn't worth the negative publicity you get from playing fast and loose.
So what's your sense? You've been in and out of government. Which presidents have you worked for?
I worked for George H.W. Bush as an intern and on his campaign back in '88, but I worked most seriously and at the highest level with George W. Bush. I was in his administration for almost all 8 years.
How would you describe the Bipartisan Center that you're with now?
Well, I'm with the Bipartisan Policy Center, which is a center that has this great idea of let's bring together people from both parties, senior, smart people, and see if they can come to solutions, to answers about the thorny questions. While I'm there, I head the Presidential Leadership Initiative. And look, the fact that the presidents are important in our system and the amount of power that the presidency has and the respect for the institution, that's not a partisan idea. These are bipartisan ideas. And so I talk about the importance of the presidency as an American institution in my work at the Bipartisan Policy Center.
Who, in your experience after doing all this research, used money the most with politicians?
Well, Rockefeller certainly did a lot. These days, you've got the tech people. I mean, it's very interesting that this issue about CEOs is in the headlines. Just this week, we saw about Elon Musk and how much money he's raising for the Trump super PAC. So it's constant. All these guys have to be aware of it, and the politicians are quite aware of it too. They need money. John Marcano, who I talk about in the book, said there's three things important in politics. There's money, and then I forgot the other two. So money has been an important part of the story throughout.
You say that $3 billion is spent on lobbying in this town. Would that money be spent if those folks weren't going to get something for it?
Well, I think that money sometimes is spent on offense. Like, I want this. I want this bill or this tax break, but it's also spent on defense. There is this theory of selective enforcement where there's so many regulations and so many enforcement bureaucrats who could go after any company. Sometimes they choose to go over one over the other. Maybe it's for headline reasons. Maybe it's to tell a story. Maybe it's to send a signal or a message. Elon Musk, the Wall Street Journal has noted, has suddenly been subject to a number of investigations from the Department of Labor and from the FTC in recent years. And the Journal editorial, I think they described it in a very clever way. They said, it's not like President Biden has said, I want you to target Elon Musk. But in the Democratic establishment being critical of Musk, the message is out there that Musk is a unfavored person these days.
Another one of your features is Katharine Graham.
I assume you knew her pretty well, right? She was the publisher of the Washington Post, one of the few female CEOs I talk about. She took over the paper after her husband committed suicide. And there was the sense that she was going to sell the paper or get rid of the paper. And she said, we are not selling this paper. And there are a couple of people who are kind of rude to her, like Ted Sorensen, the speechwriter from the Kennedy administration, came and had lunch with her. And they were talking about a possible job. And he said, the only job I want is yours. Why don't you step aside? And she would not have it. She was determined to be the publisher of the Washington Post. And she was that through some very consequential periods, including the Vietnam War and Watergate, Pentagon Papers. And in having that role in those years, she definitely ran afoul of certain presidents, including Lyndon Johnson, who used to berate her all the time in person, in his bedroom at times, including one time when he was getting undressed and she got a little uncomfortable. And he saw that she was uncomfortable and he told her to turn around. And then she turned around and he continued to berate her. So she definitely had a lot of up-close interactions with the presidents. I also admire the way that she really tried to be bipartisan on the social scene. That doesn't mean that she was a Democrat and the paper leans left, but she would have parties with Reagan and his family. She would have parties with Bush. The only person she didn't have parties was with Nixon because Nixon's chief of staff, Haldeman, H.R. Haldeman, said, we don't do lunches with the Washington Post. But in general, she saw the social scene in Washington as a bipartisan thing.
Anybody doing that kind of thing today?
Well, my dear friend Juliana Glover does that. She has these parties. She has a bit of a salon at her house, and she's nonpartisan in doing it. But and she's in Kalorama, not Georgetown. Not the legendary Georgetown cocktail party.
What's Kalorama?
Kalorama is a neighborhood just north of DuPont Circle that is a beautiful neighborhood. It has some of the best architecture in Washington, and Juliana's home is there. But I would agree with the premise of the question, which is it's less frequent these days. And even the fact that the phrase Georgetown cocktail party is said with such vitriol is one of the reasons why these parties don't happen to the same extent. And also the partisanship that's going on means that they don't happen in a bipartisan way.
Even though Juliana Glover may be nonpartisan, would she be having these dinners if it wasn't an opportunity to have access?
I think I know Juliana for a long time, and I think she truly just likes the social scene and having people and making great friends. And I've made some great friends at her parties. Is it helpful to her to know everybody in town? Sure. But people wouldn't go there if they didn't find the parties pleasant and fun to be at and worth being seen at.
Any of them fundraisers?
I don't think I've ever been at a fundraiser at her house, but I've been to many book parties at her house, including some that she's had for me.
Lee Iacocca, you say, was his own lobbyist. Who was he?
Lee Iacocca was an automotive executive in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And he started at Ford, eventually went to Chrysler. He also evolved in terms of his politics. In the late 60s and early 70s, he was lobbying the Nixon administration against Ralph Naderite type regulations, safety regulations in cars that we now have. He was opposed to those, so he had a free market approach, a less regulatory approach back then. And then, as Chrysler, the company he became CEO of, got into trouble, suddenly he was more interested in government help in terms of protectionism, limits on the number of Japanese cars that could come into the U.S., for example, but also bailouts. There was a famous government bailout of Chrysler in the Carter years. And then when the Reagan administration comes around, suddenly Iacocca finds that his pro-government efforts and pro-government interests on behalf of his company are less favored. And Reagan has more of a free market approach. And in fact, there's one interaction I talk about in the book where Iacocca is pushing for a gas tax because he thinks that will be helpful to his company. And Reagan kind of pushes the idea aside, says why it's bad politically. And then he says to Iacocca, that's why you're on that side of the table in the Oval Office, and that's why I'm on this side, showing that Reagan's the president and Iacocca is not.
What's your sense of bailout money for big corporations? Is it something that should be done in this country?
I think it's usually a bad idea. I don't think it helps the company long term. I don't think it helps certainly doesn't help the debt or deficit, and I'm not sure it helps the economy. However, there have been times when it has been used, and so, for example, we had the government was involved in the bailout of Bear Stearns in 2008 when I was in the Bush administration, and then the Lehman Brothers collapse happens, and government chooses not to get involved in that. And I think the mixed signal there is what contributed to the financial collapse. So perhaps the government should have gotten involved in the Lehman one once they had set the example of doing the Bear Stearns one.
Where were you during the time that George W. Bush bailed out a lot of corporations?
So I was initially in the White House, the deputy at the Domestic Policy Council, and I remember being in a meeting with Hank Paulson, who had been the head of Goldman Sachs, and he comes in and he was talking about how they're starting to notice problems in the economy. But then I moved over to the Department of HHS, Health and Human Services, where I was the deputy secretary, and the financial collapse happened while I was at HHS.
Why do you do government?
Why did I do government?
Yeah.
I love this country, and I wanted to give back to it. I grew up in New York in the 1970s. My parents were real patriotic. They would take us to the voting booth, and they showed how important it was to vote. My grandparents had come from Europe, all four of them, and if they had stayed in Europe, they probably would not have survived the Second World War. So I was grateful to this country as a place of freedom, a place of security, and there were a lot of people who were kind of talking down America in the 70s, as we have today. And America had a lot of problems in the 70s. And I wanted to be involved in policy as a way to make things better. And I was inspired by a couple of politicians on both sides of the aisle. Ed Koch, who was the mayor of New York, who I was lucky enough to befriend later in his life, he kind of gave New York his mojo back. And he said, let's talk up New York instead of talking it down. And then Ronald Reagan, on the Republican side, kind of gave the country its mojo back, talked positively about America. Morning in America was his 1984 campaign theme. He helped bring about the end of the Cold War in a way that was advantageous to the U.S., and he helped bring back the American economy. So I got the sense that going to Washington and being involved in policy could help make things better.
You cite your father, who you've lost during this process during the last year or so, as being available to read your book and to talk about it. Tell us about him.
My father was a teacher in the New York City school systems. He taught American history, had a real love of America, and I got my love of American history in large part from him. He had many books around the house. My parents both had many books around the house. He had tried to get a PhD in the 1950s at City College. We're still not exactly sure why he didn't get the PhD. He ended up with a master's, and he used to just say enigmatically, the PhD is a jealous mistress, which could mean he didn't have time for it. Could mean once my mom came into the picture, he was focused on other things. It could mean, and we heard kind of indications of this, that he didn't get along with his dissertation advisor. But in any event, he didn't get the PhD, although I later did, and my brother also got a PhD. But he just loved America and loved American history, and he inspired me. And I was, it was really great to spend time with him while I was working on this book. I have a very, very close friend named Alan Rechtschaffen who said to me, "You'll never regret time spent with your father." And so I used to go there where he was living. My father was living in Ringhouse, and I would bring the manuscript and I would go through it, and I would just sit there with him. He was old; he was in his 90s. Sometimes he slept, sometimes he was awake, but just being there with him was inspirational to me.
When did he die?
Yeah, he died this spring, 94 years old, had a great American life, had 11 grandchildren, and I miss him, but he really he had a great life and nothing to be sad about.
Tevi Troy has a brother named Gil. What does Gil do? I know you talk about him and your brother Dan.
Gil is also an American historian. He has moved to Israel, and he writes a lot about Israel and the problems the Jewish community is facing around the world in terms of anti-Semitism. He's a terrific historian, a great writer, a great speaker. He looks at my manuscripts before I submit them, as I do to his, and it's great to have him as a sounding board.
Another name in the book is Jack Welch.
Neutron Jack, yeah, he was the CEO of GE, which at the time was the most profitable or the biggest American company based on a market cap. And he had this method of, he believed, and this was based on kind of GE philosophy, that you fire the lowest performing people every year and you're constantly looking to generate more profits, better business. He would purchase companies or acquire companies, then he would sell them. And the Neutron Jack was this sense that he was willing to use layoffs in order to maximize profits. He hated the name. He thought it was unfair. But he said he also hated bureaucracy and he hated waste, and he wanted to make sure his companies were as efficient as possible. And GE did have record profits and record stock prices while he was there, so he was a very successful CEO in that sense. However, since then, GE has undergone some very tough times, and they're not nearly the colossus they once were.
How did he deal with the government?
Well, he was a Republican, but he was friends with presidents of both parties. He would play golf with Bill Clinton. He would visit Ronald Reagan in the White House. Multiple presidents wanted him to be a cabinet secretary, but he wisely knew that that was not the right role for a CEO. And I would caution all CEOs to be wary of taking a cabinet secretary job, because when you're a CEO, you're used to being in charge. You say, do this, do that, and it happens. And as a cabinet secretary, A, you're reporting to someone above you, the president. But B, it's not like you can just make things happen. You can't you can't be Neutron Jack in the Department of Labor and say we're going to lay off 20% of the workforce. It just doesn't work that way. So I think CEOs often find the government process frustrating.
As you know, there were times in this country's history where CEOs did take the big jobs as Secretary of Defense and Secretary of Commerce, places like that. More or less now?
I think we still see it. I mean, Trump clearly wanted some CEOs in his cabinet. Sometimes it didn't work out so well. I mean, Rex Tillerson at ExxonMobil did not have a good time and famously was fired by tweet that he saw while he was on the toilet battling a stomach ailment in Africa. Andy Puzder was going to be the Secretary of Labor, and in the process of going through his record, they found certain allegations against him by a former wife that led to the blowing up of his nomination. So sometimes these CEOs try to get involved in Washington and find that it doesn't work out well for them.
My memory is Rex Tillerson, when he left, Exxon was given $450 million or something like that. What do you think it feels like ending up as Secretary of State when you can't get anything done?
It's got to be frustrating. And Tillerson had some skepticism of the federal government from his time at Exxon. He thought that his experts at Exxon knew foreign affairs and energy issues better than the people who worked in the government, so he was somewhat dismissive of them. And then he was often in conflict with the White House because he didn't necessarily agree with them on a host of issues, including moving the embassy to Jerusalem in Israel and the Iran deal. Trump wanted to get out of it, and Tillerson wanted to stay in it. So he found that he was on the other side of the White House on a bunch of issues and frustrated in that he couldn't make his policy views the policy of the United States of America.
Another person on the list is Rupert Murdoch. How has he used his powerful position to influence government?
Yeah, throughout the book, I talk about a lot of CEOs who either have platforms or purchase or develop platforms. Henry Ford had the Dearborn Independent. Elon Musk purchased X, formerly Twitter. Murdoch becomes famous because of his platforms. Starts in newspapers and then purchases TV stations and then famously develops Fox News, which was a massive success, not only financially in terms of profits, but also in terms of giving a voice to Republicans and conservatives who felt like they did not have a voice in the other mainstream media networks. So Murdoch becomes very influential in Republican politics. He befriends multiple American presidents, including Reagan a little bit, Bush, and then he has this love-hate relationship with Donald Trump. But he's also hated by Democratic presidents. Both Obama and Biden really disliked him. Obama had this kind of anti-Murdoch effort in the White House that was led by Anita Dunn, who is now an even more senior official in the Biden White House. And Biden has also made it clear that he doesn't like Murdoch and talked about how dangerous he is. Even made a joke about him, I think, at the White House Correspondents' Dinner, where he said that Murdoch, who's even older than Biden, he says he likes a guy who's so old it can make him, Biden, look like Harry Styles.
But you point out in the book that there's a fellow named Roger Ailes that did a lot of the Rupert Murdoch work by running and building Fox News. How much power did he have with having things changed or done for Rupert Murdoch or for his own point of view when he ran Fox News?
Yeah, Al's absolutely was a brilliant television mind, even as he was a non-admirable person, and especially with his relations with women. But Al just understood how television worked in the political era and in the political realm. He told Nixon in 1968 when Nixon says, and Ailes is a young man at the time, Nixon says something dismissive about television, and Ailes tells him, no, it's the most important thing out there in terms of campaigns, and he teaches the Nixon team how to use television. He helps George H.W. Bush in his fight with Dan Rather on television. He helps Reagan in his 1984 debate against Walter Mondale, which is in the news again because Reagan does poorly in his first debate. People think he's too old. And then he has a comeback in his second debate, something I'm sure Biden's going to try and do because Biden looked too old in his first debate. I don't know if he has a Roger Ailes out there, but he is certainly going to try and do differently if they do have that debate in September. And Ailes is the strategic mind behind the development of Fox News. Murdoch gives him the platform, Murdoch provides the money, but Ailes is really the genius behind the creation of Fox News.
In general, what's your attitude about the revolving door? Somebody comes in government, then goes out to a corporation or goes out to a media company, and the back and forth. Some people do that more than one time. Yeah.
I know there's a lot of criticism of the revolving door and that people leave government and then go into a corporation. But at the same time, it's not like it's fair to say to someone, well, you worked in government and you can't work anywhere else the rest of your life. So I think people have to have other opportunities beyond government, or you won't have good people go into government. So I think it's complicated. Obviously, there should be non-competes and non-disclosures, and there can be some limitations on lobbying people who you've worked with. But I don't think that it's fair to say because you've worked in government, you can have other opportunities in the private sector.
Steve Jobs and his attitude about government.
Yeah, Steve Jobs is kind of the unicorn of the book. I talk in the book about a number of CEOs who thought they could ignore Washington and get away with it, and most of them got burned, including Rockefeller, including Lou Wasserman, who changed his approach and befriended government after it came after him, and including Bill Gates, who thought he was going to make Microsoft so big that he wouldn't have to worry about government. Jobs, in contrast, he also thinks he can ignore government, and in large part, he can, and he gets away with it. He's friendly with Bill Clinton. He gets an award, I think, from the Bush White House, but he really stays out of government, thinks it's beneath him, and for the most part is successful in that approach. But he's rare, and it's not a strategy I would recommend.
As you know, there's a Rockefeller Foundation. There is a Ford Foundation. There is a Buffett Foundation. There's a Gates Foundation. All of these people, multi-millionaires, billionaires, create these foundations. What role do these foundations, because you're basically at one now, play in the town?
Yeah, the Bipartisan Policy Center is not one of these foundations, but it is funded by some of these foundations. And the CEOs, they don't do things just for for their health or for the beneficence of the world. They see a value in it to them. Rockefeller was trying to do two things when he created the first big one. In that, he was trying to get some tax protection. The income tax had been put into effect in the 1910s, and it was something that he had to worry about with all his money. And so it's a way of protecting your money, or at least directing your money towards something that you want. But also, he was trying to change his reputation as this rapacious, greedy, sharp-elbowed creator of the Standard Oil monopoly. And he wanted to show that he had actually given something good to the country. He helped the country during World War I. He would try and help boost the economy during times of economic difficulty, and he was just trying to change the narrative about himself. And I think all of the CEOs who are creating these big foundations are to some extent following Rockefeller, in that they're looking for some tax advantage, they're looking to change the narrative about themselves. Bill Gates, for example, was also kind of loathed in the 80s as this guy who creates this Microsoft monopoly. And then he becomes the kind of avuncular Bill Gates who runs the Gates Foundation and gives money for vaccines and all kinds of good things like that. So the CEOs see value in creating these foundations and funding these foundations. But sometimes they also do some real good things for the world as well.
I don't want to get too far in the weeds, but there's a 501c3 think tank, and there's a 501c4 think tank. Or it's not really a think tank, but the fours can lobby, the threes can't. The average person doesn't have a clue about how this works. What's your sense? Is this a good thing for government?
I think that it is good that we are a charitable nation and that we give tax deductibility for people who give money to charities. Now, there are reasons to think that certain things may not count as charities. I mean, there's been a lot of talk these days about maybe changing donations to university endowments and maybe not making them tax deductible. If you look at these places like Harvard or Yale or Princeton that have billions and billions of dollars in their endowments, and they also make money from tuition, maybe, and we also have these huge debt and deficit problems, maybe those things don't need to be tax deductible. But I do think there is value in giving some tax deductibility to charities that are out there to try and help people.
What's been Mark Zuckerberg's relationship with government?
Well, Zuckerberg talks to Bill Gates early in his career, and Bill Gates, having been burned by government, as I suggested earlier, he tells Zuckerberg, get an office there now. And there is Washington. And Zuckerberg is early in the corporation process and the development of a corporation in terms of developing a very powerful, large Washington office with a guy named Joel Kaplan, who runs it, was a White House colleague of mine, a very smart and effective guy. And Facebook has been trying to build friends through the development of that Washington office. It's not always easy because Facebook is not that popular in both Republican and Democratic circles. So they need all the help they can get. But Gates has been involved in that sense. He also he hosted a book event for George W. Bush after Bush was no longer president, but at a time when Republicans were regaining control of Congress. So there was some strategic element to that. A lot of his people and a lot of tech people in general helped Obama in Obama's 2008 and 2012 campaigns. And and you want to talk revolving door, there was a lot of revolving door between the big tech companies like Facebook and Google and the Obama administration. And then he has this kind of love-hate relationship with Donald Trump. He's not as hysterically anti-Trump as a lot of the other tech CEOs are. So he tries to build a bit of a relationship with him. But at the same time, his staff is very liberal and very critical of any interactions with Trump, which cause him internal problems. Something that the Trump's White House staff makes fun of, as I lay out in the book. And then eventually he and Trump have a falling out, even though he and Trump had dinner together. But Trump says very negative things about Musk, saying that he was kissing up to him while Trump was president. But then Biden comes in, and Biden talks about how dangerous Facebook is and how much he dislikes Facebook. So they're in the unfortunate position of what I call being friendless in Washington, where both sides have real problems with them.
Who does the most in this town with lobbying? Of all the companies you talk about.
So it's interesting. I talk in the book about this theory of lobbying parity, where if you take two companies or two industries that are on opposite sides of an issue, they kind of bring themselves to a draw in terms of their lobbying resources. There's only so much you can spend on lobbying. There's only so many lobbyists you can deploy. So then the question is, if you are at parity with the opposing company on how much you're spending and how many lobbyists you have, because it gets super saturated at some point, then how are you going to break the tie? And what I talk about in the book is sometimes the CEOs themselves can be the tiebreakers. If you have a CEO like a Tim Cook, who's very good at dealing with Washington, and on the other side is a CEO who doesn't like coming to Washington, maybe that CEO who's better at dealing with Washington can be the thumb on the scale, the guy who can tip things in your direction. I was influenced in this by a company called Barron Public Affairs that has written some interesting briefs on this. But I don't think there's any one company that does the most in lobbying. I think that these companies see that lobbying has its limits and that they need to find other things to shape the narrative, whether it's a CEO or having think tanks or different scholars write things that shape the way the American people view issues.
Which president has done the best job of dealing with corporations?
Yeah, that's a good question, because there's so many corporations and so many different aspects to it, and you just have to ask, how can you cabin that question? I mean, I like to think of Ronald Reagan, because he was very favorably viewed by most, not all corporate execs, but the corporate execs I talk about in the book seem to be big fans of Reagan, in large part because he was trying to change the 1970s view of government and get the government off the corporations' backs. That said, Lee Iacocca, who I mentioned earlier, wanted certain things from the government that Reagan wasn't willing to provide. So even a president like Reagan, who is very good with dealing with corporations, they are going to have some corporations that don't like them, because there's always winners and losers in this game.
Why is Oprah Winfrey on your list?
Yeah, in the book I talk about how many of these CEOs develop platforms as a result of becoming famous and becoming rich and powerful. Oprah used a platform to become rich and famous and powerful, and then she creates this media empire. And I just thought it was interesting to look at her, and she had a slightly different perspective, and she also had the show. The show was very powerful, but for years she studiously avoided being involved in politics. And it's only in 2000 that she has both George W. Bush and Al Gore on the show, and both of them see bumps in their favorability numbers after going on the show. So we start to realize the power of Oprah in the political world in the 21st century. And then she breaks precedent in 28 and endorses Barack Obama, something she had never done before. So Oprah has this media empire, and she occasionally deploys it to great political effect.
Good idea, bad idea that somebody like Oprah or any of these folks use their platforms to have influence?
It's hard to say whether it's a good idea or a bad idea, in that there's benefits and there's costs to doing it. Sometimes someone like Oprah felt that she felt such an affinity to Obama. She thought it was so important that she would break this longstanding practice of not endorsing a candidate. But a lot of her viewers are Republicans, and so there's potential costs to doing it. Someone like Lou Wasserman recognized that staying out of politics was potentially costly, not only to his business, but to Lou Wasserman's plans for dominating much of Hollywood. And so he recognized he had to get involved. So in that sense, it's a good idea. But it's potentially a bad idea in general in that it creates this larger animus that the American people have towards corporations. And in that, we have this situation that we started talking about at the beginning, where both Democrats and Republicans seem to dislike companies at this current moment.
Who's your favorite president and why?
I love Ronald Reagan. He's the president I grew up with. There's the theory that your favorite Saturday Night Live cast is the one you grew up with. So there's that element to Reagan. But I just loved Reagan's use of theater, the fact that he came from this pop culture background, the way that he had a clear ideological approach. And Peggy Noonan would write about how the idea of Reagan ruled. People knew what Reagan stood for. And he also helped really give America a sense of pride back. So I'm a big Reagan fan.
Who did you dislike the most?
I'm not a huge Jimmy Carter fan. I think he was somewhat petty. I think that he was small-minded. He was nasty to journalists in a way that he didn't need to be. And it's interesting in doing these 5 books that I've done on presidential history over the last 20 years. I see that sometimes I change my views of presidents. So Bill Clinton, for example, I think comes off better in every one of my books than I thought about Bill Clinton in the 1990s. But Jimmy Carter kind of confirms my negative view of him from the 1970s.
What did Bill Clinton do that changed your attitude toward him?
I think Bill Clinton, well, I wrote a book about presidents and pop culture, and Bill Clinton was a huge reader, which I admire. In my book about infighting in the White House, I think Clinton largely managed that pretty well. He was fair to people on both sides of the aisle. I mean, he grew up in Arkansas. He knew people who were Republicans and Democrats. In this book, I talk about he reached out to CEOs because he genuinely cared about what they thought and thought that they could provide ideas and insights and benefits to him. So I just think that Clinton really thought about how to govern. And that doesn't mean I agreed with everything he did, and certainly I condemned his affair with an intern in the Oval Office. But Clinton was kind of the last bipartisan president we had in some ways.
What impact did Henry Luce have on the country, and who was he?
Henry Luce is this brilliant kid who's born to missionary parents in China. And he leaves his parents, goes to Hotchkiss, which is a fancy school, and to Yale. And he's very interested in journalism. And he sees in the late teens, early 20s, I'm talking about the 1920s, that we don't really have a national news source. You have local papers, but there's no one national source you can go to find out what's happening everywhere across the country. And he has this idea for something. He's not sure what it is. It's kind of inchoate. But something that will tell people what's going on across the country. And now with the development of power printing press and railroads and the ability to get stuff around the country much more quickly, he sees there's this opportunity. And he and a friend from Yale create this thing that becomes Time magazine in 1923. And it's really a sensation because people were interested, even if you lived in Iowa, in what's going on in Montana. And this magazine that Luce creates helps him build an empire and is very successful. And it really helps shape the way the news has developed in this country. But he also really helps shape how we view presidents, because he would have features on the presidents, what the president's doing that day, what the president is interested in, what the president's eating. And these were things that we didn't necessarily know about before. So as a presidential historian, I find early Time magazine a great source of information. And he also had this thing called the breakfast technique. He would have one of his journalists interview a political subject, and he would do it for breakfast, and he would write about what that guy was eating for breakfast. And there's this famous one in 1936 of Alf Landon, the governor of Kansas, who was running against Franklin Roosevelt, and Luce hated Roosevelt and wanted him to lose, and so that he gave him the positive time treatment, including the breakfast technique, and Landon, for some odd reason, had kidneys for breakfast. And even today, 90 years later, you have this guy Lance Morrow, who writes a lot for the Wall Street Journal, writes great stuff. He says nobody could forget those kidneys. Right? It's a detail that just sticks with you.
You've got Tim Cook on your list, runs Apple. What has been his relationship with presidents?
Yeah, Tim Cook is a logistics guy. He made Apple run. He knew how to get the factories working. He wasn't the kind of visionary that Steve Jobs was. He didn't develop these iconic products, but he knew how to make things run. And then when Jobs dies, Cook is the appointed successor. And I think he initially thought that he could just keep head down and focus on running the company. But he quickly realized that in this environment, with government so important and so overweening, that he needed to be involved. And he was also, like Zuckerberg, willing to talk to Trump. And the one thing I noticed was that the senior government officials he talked to would say what a good listener he was. He didn't just come and say, I need this benefit for the iPhone. He would ask the policymakers what their problems were, what their challenges were, and he would try and help them. And he opened certain Apple factories in the U.S. that Trump liked to tout. And he developed a good relationship with Trump, even though he's almost certainly a Democrat, and he's also had good ties with the Biden administration. He's just smart and strategic about how he does this. Doesn't make a big splash about it, but he's really made an effort to get to know Washington and be known here.
Jamie Dimon.
Yeah, Jamie Dimon is from the financial industry, and was very involved in the bailouts during the 2008 financial crisis, has developed relationships with presidents on both sides, and a couple of times has done things that were seen as favorable to Trump, including joining Trump's council for a while of business leaders. And then in recent months has said, as most CEOs were kind of critical of Trump or kind of seeing him as beyond the pale, he was saying, we're going to have to deal with Trump, and recognizing that Trump has a chance of winning this next election, and being open to him. And when you're a president like Trump or a politician like Trump, where you're getting criticized from everywhere, you kind of like when you have a CEO who's willing to listen to you and take you seriously. That doesn't mean they don't have their fights. And Dimon crossed Trump when he suggested that if he ran against Trump in 2020, he would beat him. And Dimon quickly apologized for it, but not before Trump came out with a vicious and devastating tweet criticizing Dimon, saying that he's this banker and that he's not so great and he's not so smart. And he said, and then after saying all these negative things, he says, other than that, he's a wonderful guy, which is like a classic Trump punchline.
You have 3 appendix in your back of your book, and you have a number of codas. Explain how you set this book up, and if somebody goes out and buys it, what do they get? How's it laid out?
Oh, you get great stuff if you get this book. The Power of the Money is a definite must-buy. It has lots of pictures, and it has these codas which kind of summarize the career of these CEOs. It's kind of my last look at them before I move on to the next person. The book is not written with each chapter on one CEO, but each chapter is on a period where multiple CEOs will appear, and there are certain CEOs who are on the national landscape for a long time, so they can be in multiple chapters. But when we take our last look at them, usually before they pass away, I have a coda that kind of summarizes what I think about them and how their careers ended up. Then in terms of the appendices, I am a big fan of appendices for highlighting aspects of a book that maybe the reader didn't pick up. And so in my appendices, for example, I have one on great jokes that CEOs told, or jokes that were told about CEOs. And so I compile all the jokes into one appendix. You can find them there. I also have an appendix on this growth in Washington regulation and regulatory bodies, and just trying to graphically depict the way in which John D. Rockefeller was operating in what I call blank space. There was no government entity that was going to stop him or could stop him from building his empire. But today, there are so many regulatory bodies, there are so many regulations that every CEO has to take government into account, which is, I think, the main message of the book. And that appendix really shows it in a visual way what's been going on.
Tevi Troy's family, number of kids, I think they're 4, am I right?
4 Troys, yeah.
And your wife. Where'd you meet your wife, and what are the kids doing?
I met my wife, Cammie, in Washington. It was a setup. My sister-in-law set us up on a blind date, so thank you to Cheryl. We were about to celebrate our 25th anniversary, so I'm grateful to Cheryl and also to Cammie. She's a contract writer with the Food and Drug Administration. She's a terrific writer. When she deigns to read my stuff, she does good edits, but she's not really into the political stuff, or the history stuff, so she doesn't read my stuff that often. We do have 4 kids. The oldest is named Ezra, has just moved to Florida. I have daughters Ruthie and Rena, who are both in college now, and then my youngest son is Noah, who's still in high school.
Any of them interested in being writers?
Not that I have seen yet, but I'm not sure I would have said at age 17 that I was going to be a writer, so let's see what happens.
What's the hardest thing about writing?
I think the hardest thing is finding a good idea that nobody else has had, to find that kind of clear pathway. So you're not repeating what somebody else has said, and you're not going on trodden ground. You're really kind of breaking a new path and saying something interesting and different. And that's what I try and do in all my writing, not just in my books, but in my articles as well.
You have a next book in mind?
Well, I would joke and say that it's Presidents and blank, but I don't know what the blank is yet. But it's possible that my next book might not be just about presidents. I think I've written 5 books about presidents over a 2-decade period in which I was also a White House aide in that period. It was a very consequential period in which we had the growth of the presidency, and the presidency is much more powerful now in 2024 than it was when I started writing about the presidency. And so I might look up something different, and it might be in the area of why we're so polarized and how we can fix it.
Where'd you get your PhD?
I got my PhD from the University of Texas at Austin, which was a great place to get a PhD, in large part because I not only took classes in the humanities side of things at the American Civilization Department, but I also cross-listed a lot of classes with the Lyndon B. Johnson School of Public Affairs. And my mentor there was a woman named Elspeth Rostow. She's unfortunately passed away. But her husband was Walt Rostow, whom I'm sure you remember, who was the National Security Advisor under Kennedy and Johnson. And she was really the first person to give me a look under the hood of what it's like to be in the White House, to interact with White House aides and presidents. And she also gave me an amazing reading list on the presidency that I had to read in order to understand the subject.
Who is your favorite columnist, political writer, besides yourself?
I would never put myself on this list. My mentor, inspiration growing up was William Safire. I was reading the New York Times as a kid, and I disagreed with most of the columnists, even as a teenager. But this one guy, William Safire, seemed to make sense to me. I read his books Before the Fall, and he wrote a book about Job. He wrote a novel about Lincoln and the Civil War, and I just thought his stuff was terrific. I loved his On Language column, and there's a great story about him that was really inspirational to me in some ways, that he left the Nixon administration to become a columnist for the New York Times. And by his own admission, his column was a flop at first. He said it was terrible. He didn't know what to say. And then he was sitting at his desk staring at the telephone. I'm not sure you can do that these days because you don't always have a telephone on a desk these days. And he said, that's what I'm good at, the telephone. I know people. And he said, I'm going to use my knowledge of people in Washington to break stories, really make it a reported column. And so it wasn't just him opining, it was him talking to people in the know and explaining what's going on in Washington. And I'm not saying I do that with my writings. What I try and do is use my knowledge of presidential history to inform people in Washington of what's going on today.
The name of the book is The Power and the Money. The subtitle is The Epic Clashes Between Commanders-in-Chief and Titans of Industry. Our guest, Tevi Troy. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to the BookNotes Plus podcast. Please rate and review BookNotes Plus, and don't forget to follow so you never miss an episode. Questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at podcasts@c-span.org.